It's time now for the news review of this bulletin. In Britain, people are facing the deepening cost of living crisis as inflation rose to 40-year high last month. According to the Office for National Statistics, the Consumer Price Index rose to 9.4% in June from 9.1% in the previous month. That was the highest level since February 1982. The Centre says sharp rise in food and motor fuel prices are the main contributors to the rising inflation. The ongoing war in Ukraine is also said to be partly responsible for the price rise. The UK government is facing criticism for offering below-inflation pay rises to ease economic pressure on workers. Unions say that they want bigger raises. The Bank of England has also increased the interest rate 5 times since December to control inflation. It is predicted that the inflation could hit 11% in October. Said Purza is our correspondent joining us from London. We also have Justin Urquhart Stewart, Director of the Seven Investment Management, who joins us from London. Okay, welcome to you both. Said Purza, first over to you. Obviously, this is not good news for the UK, and everybody's wondering how high can this inflation go because we're seeing increases. However, tell us what you have for us on that end.
It certainly isn't good news for the UK, nor is it for the population, especially people who are on the lowest of incomes in this country. A new study carried out by Bristol University putting the number of people who are what they call in very difficult financial situation to 4.4 million people as a result of this rising cost of living in this country. A couple of factors that are contributing to the prices going up, to the inflation. For example, some observers blame the war in Ukraine as well as the energy shocks, but others saying those assertions fall flat. The former obviously making that assertion because Ukraine is the so-called breadbasket of Europe. It's a major producer of grains. The cost of grains have gone up because of the war. And also Russia, a major exporter of fossil fuels, European countries deciding to wean themselves off of Russian energy as a result of the war. But others are saying, look, the UK's inflation is 1.6% higher than its peers in the rest of Europe. That the reason it's looking at a higher percentage now is because of what they call core inflation that had been in place prior, months before the war in Ukraine began. Or let's call it a direct result of Brexit. One example of how that has contributed is, for example, with the withdrawal of the UK from the European Union, it put an end to migrant European workers and their movements around the UK, free movement by migrant workers. That led to a vacuum that had to be filled with local workers. And that, in turn, led to what they call wage inflation. Where you remember the example of truck driver shortages that had to be met with people living here in Britain. And those people asked for higher wages to become truck drivers. So a couple other examples of how people are having to pay more nowadays for things that they had to pay less before. I'll give you some real life examples. Tomatoes, for example, May 2021, 2.93 pounds per kilograms. May 2022, 3.32 pounds per kilogram. The same across the board, chicken, mince, and all the rest. So some of the people I talked to today as they were doing their grocery shoppings, and these are not discretionary goods, Kava, these are essentials you're talking about. You can't duck out of buying food and to feed yourself and your family. And people were saying they've had to cut down on many things to be able to continue buying as much as they had been buying, or they're not going to the same store to buy the essentials that they need. They're shopping around to be able to provide for their families. So that is the shock that is being felt by, as I mentioned earlier, people on the lowest of incomes, probably people under the £28,000 a year mark. People who are earning more, 100,000, give or take, are not feeling the pinch as much. And then there is the issue of energy. You remember Ofgem, the energy regulator, has raised the cap on the amount that energy companies can charge the consumers in the UK. That has really been a shock to people's finances, and they're going to feel that even more acutely, people on the lower end of the income category, come the cold season. The same also with fuels at the forecourts for people who have to fill up their tanks. Those people, too, feeling the pinch as well.
Well, Justin, we could talk about how we got here, but let's talk about how we can get out of it. Of course, what you think, and at the same time, whether any of the potential contenders for the premiership have any solutions, if you are listening to them at all, in terms of moving forward.
It's going to be very difficult indeed to try and find the right person. Why? Because, frankly, none of the leaders have actually been through this at all. As your correspondent was just saying, you have to go back to the early 80s, or even worse, in the early 70s, where we saw inflation at one point actually touching 25%. Now, the correspondent mentioned about this core inflation, and that's the crucial element, because normally inflation will vary every single month because it's calculated monthly. So if oil has gone up by doubled in a year, it'll be in that particular month. When that month drops off, then you'll see the inflation rate coming down. That's fine, of course, but of course you've got other goods now going up in price because the price of oil and gas and other fuels have gone up so much. So this is, I'm afraid, a rather corny old line, a perfect storm, a combination of issues where you've got the pandemic, you've got stretched trade routes and supply chains. Remember, everything used to be just-in-time delivery, which meant that your trading was almost like an elastic band, very tight, very efficient, but when it snaps, very difficult to put back, and that's one of the issues we've got there. So add that to the combination of issues, people saying inflation's at 10%, my wage rise is only going to be 2, 3, 4%, I'm going to be worse off. There is no instant solution to this. A lot of the central bankers say, we'll put up interest rates. Well, actually, that doesn't do a great deal. It will stop people spending maybe quite so much, but doesn't actually really affect inflation in its current form. Now, what Britain has to do now is focus on the areas it's been successful at, not by tax benefits or extra tax breaks, but encouraging investment into these areas. And these are mostly high tech, not necessarily in London, and that's the way out of this. And I'm afraid the tax cuts that the proposals coming from the people who wish to be head of the Tory party, Conservative party, and therefore Prime Minister, most of their plans, frankly, aren't going to work. Now, this isn't just a British issue, it's a global issue. As you quite rightly mentioned, we've added our own little spice to it with Brexit as well, which has had an impact and added extra cost. After all, Britain, for some strange reason, decided to leave the world's largest free trade bloc and to be out on its own. That's a bad decision at the best of times. Add a combination of war in Eastern Europe, rising prices of commodities, particularly food commodities, and that will cause further social unrest in weaker countries around the world who are often dependent upon that food supplies coming from Ukraine. So whether it's Lebanon, Yemen, countries like that, you will then fall into national social problems and political instability, which is exactly what none of us want to have.
Indeed. I wish we had more time to discuss this. We just don't. Thank you very much, Said Pourreza, correspondent from London, and thank you, Justin Urquhart-Stewart, Director of the Seven Investment Management, also from London. And with that, we come to an end for this edition of the News Review. Thanks for tuning in.